And welcome to another episode of What If Mania with your hosts, DJ, AJ, and Baldy. Last week, we started with Taker versus Sting and ended by saying this week's episode would be all about the biggest botch in wrestling history, the invasion angle of WCW and what then became the Alliance. While we could do a trilogy of a rant on how badly our hopes and expectations for what could have been the greatest wrestling angle ever was handled, we're going to touch about the invasion with our resident wrestling scholar and historian, Baldy, and then move on to focus on the poison that was injected into the WWE, the nWo. But before I turn things over to AJ, I want to ask the panel a quick check-in question. Who was your favorite WCW wrestler? For me, besides Norman Smiley and the great expertise and entertainment that he provided, I'm going to go with the original Sting, blonde-haired, super high energy, bright face paint. Something different for me, and I liked him all the way up until he became the Crow, and then liked him all the more.
See, for me, I gotta agree with TJ. I was a big Sting fan in the early '90s, but I especially loved the when he changed over into the Crow. Just how that was done. That was one of the rare things that WCW did properly. So for me, it's definitely got to be the Crow Sting.
Yeah, for me, I mean, you had like a decent crop of wrestlers to pick from. But for me, growing up in the '90s, like I mentioned in the previous episode, I think the one wrestler that kind of gave me the most laughs and one that I always enjoyed whenever he was on screen was Buff Bagwell. Um, and to kind of like touch on what T just said last episode, like how many wrestlers that were like a mid card draw, but look like they could have been a like top card draw with his top hat. Just his whole charisma when he would come out, his whole dance, just everything about it. I really enjoyed Buff Bagwell as a wrestler. Granted, he wasn't the most technical wrestler and all that stuff, but he just had so much charisma. So for me, it's got to be Buff stuff.
Yeah, that
You know,
was a
I was going to say outside of the Cougars in Las Vegas, I think AJ would be the only one to say Buff was the stuff and his number one guy in WCW.
well. That was the reason why when WCW was bought, that the first ever WCW match to take place on Raw was Booker T defending the WCW title against Buff Bagwell, and
It
it
should be, as
botched
it should
so
be.
badly that he was released from the company soon after.
So
But you know what the funny
get
thing about that match? So it was a botch, but it was also more so the fan reaction to that
They didn't know who the
match.
guy wrestlers were. Like it was yeah, it was just yeah, it was bad. Let's just leave it at that.
yeah. So getting into the episode for today, the whole point of it is to talk about the invasion angle and just kind of what led up to it and how it was kind of brought about. So maybe Baldev, if you want to just kind of go into the bit of a history lesson, could you want to just talk about the intro in terms of how the invasion angle started, what year we're kind of talking, just so people have a reference.
Well, I'm sure
Yeah.
most wrestling fans know the date, March 26, 2001. It was a week before WrestleMania 17, and Vince McMahon is in the ring making the announcement that he's going to buy WCW. All of a sudden, Shane McMahon's music hits, and he's in Panama City at Nitro, and then everyone was excited that hey, the invasion is going to happen. Like Shane McMahon owns WCW, Vince McMahon owns the WWF, and after WrestleMania, things sort of kicked off, and then it just went downhill from there. As most wrestling fans know, most of the big name WCW guys were signed to long-term Time Warner contracts, which WWE didn't want to buy out. So most of the mid carders came over. A couple of the big names like Booker T, Diamond Dallas Page were some of the few that WWE bought their contracts because it wasn't as much. But the guys like Hogan, Nash, Hall, Sting, Goldberg, the Time Warner was paying them a ton of money to just sit home. So they figured, hey, why are we going to take less money to work? So we'll let our contracts run out. And all those guys eventually, one way or another, came over to WWE, but just not during the invasion angle.
Okay. So that's a good recap. So, yeah, I mean, like, I was trying to think here, like,
it was downhill when it'll go down in history that the first ever WWF or WCW champion, you would think it'd be historic, but it ended up
Yeah,
being
that's exactly what I was
The
gonna
Rock and
say.
Stone Cold. Yeah, like
And
the
the other thing is, and I don't want to jump ahead, but like the biggest, like you start going through those names as the people that were actually signed. We're talking about DDP. We're talking about Booker. We're talking about AJ's favorite, Buff the Stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest name on that list is DDP, as like an established old, top tier guy in WCW. Booker was just starting to come into his own before they kind of collapsed. So DDP was like the biggest name that was starting off in WWE. And what was his biggest angle? Stalking the Undertaker.
Undertaker's wife.
Oh, my apologies. His wife, who he then got beat by.
Yeah, it was yeah, that angle didn't last very long. I mean, he got a great ovation because it was a shock factor of like, who was stalking Undertaker's wife, but then it just went downhill after that. And so, there wasn't really much to build on. Like that was the reason they had Stone Cold turn on Team WWF because it's, hey, we gotta make this somewhat interesting. So, Stone Cold's leading the alliance, The Rock is leading Team WWF, and just
Well, wasn't that also a big botch in itself? Was having Stone Cold run the alliance?
Yep, definitely was. But at that time, like, what else were they going to do? Like, Triple H had just been injured. A few of the other big name wrestlers at that time were on the shelf with injuries too. So they figured, okay, well, the only way this is going to look legible is if, we have our biggest star turn and end up joining the alliance to make it look like they're a real threat to the WWF. But
Which also then in turn doesn't even make it an us versus them
no, it
story
doesn't.
angle anymore, And now it becomes about Stone Cold rather than the WCW talent that you're trying to bring and build a brand around.
Yeah,
I mean, if they wanted to do what they originally did, which was build two different like entities and create two different brands, how are you going to do that without even pushing these guys? Stasiak and them.
yeah. Well, I mean, it was too much too soon for some of these guys because the WWF audience didn't know who some of these guys were. So then you're expecting them to push, and I think a couple weeks into that invasion angle, they realized it. So then they figured, okay, well, the only way this is going to work is we got to have WWF guys at the top of this.
That was clearly evident in that woefully planned Monday Night Raw main event between Booker and Buff when the
Yep.
fans were just not having it. And this was before the age of like social media and everything else.
Oh man.
And fan reaction mattered. Not as much maybe as what it does today, but back then it did. And they scrapped everything based off of that.
Yeah, and that was just, it was like, hey, we got something here, and then no, we don't.
Yeah, and so maybe Baldy, like, do you want to maybe just touch on like the fact that you had this invasion angle and you had like these like mid card WCW wrestlers coming in, but they also had the inclusion of the ECW wrestlers as well.
Well, that was
Right.
to try and make up for the facts of the lack of big name WCW guys. So they figured, hey,
Right, but like,
let's
what do
bring
you
in the big.
like? Don't you think that just kind of led to the confusion of it all? Just, I mean, I understand that they were trying to make up for the lack of star power, but like, let's be honest, like ECW, like, who did they have? Rhino, it's not like they had like
Well, I
household
mean,
names.
And even with Rhino was already in the WWE or had been
Yeah,
at that time.
that's the point I was just about to make. That outside of RVD, all the big name WCW guys at that time, like Taz, the Dudley Boys, Rhino, they were all already in the WWF. So eventually, just again having more WWF guys defect, like I don't even think most fans knew, hey, these guys are ECW originals because they were used to them as WWF guys. So at that time, like it made it again look just more like, hey, there's more WWF guys that are defecting into the alliance. So that's, yeah, it was didn't really go as planned at all.
I know the biggest thing people are kind of in, like the one thing people always agree on is that the invasion angle should have waited a year. And
Yeah.
that's a given when everybody was around and they came back in.
Yep.
But one thing that they shouldn't have done was brought in ECW because all they did was muddle it all the more. You already had enough guys coming in. Now you have even all the more talent mixing things up. And to make matters worse, as if it couldn't be already, they make Stephanie McMahon in charge of EC freaking W. the worst
Well, it
person
shows, right? Like,
to call the shots there.
this is an angle that, they could have gone for who knows how many years. Yeah, the entire angle lasted 8 months from beginning to end. And that was it because a few weeks in, they realized how bad this is. And then they kind of just wanted to wrap it up. And then just like that, it was gone. 8 months is how long it lasted.
Wow.
it's sad to think that it was only 8 months.
Yeah.
Because again, this is what I alluded to the intro. Like this could have been the biggest and best wrestling angle ever.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the biggest what ifs, right? Like, what if they had waited one more year? What could have happened?
Or, I mean, the bigger what if, and I think a more practical one now, is what if they just spent that money to make some money and it literally bought out those contracts and brought him in at that point?
Yeah, that's another one.
Because that's what he should have done. I mean, waiting 1 year was fine, but he had the chance and the opportunity, but chose not to pay Nash, not to pay Hogan, not to pay Hall, the guys who are WCW, and be like, yeah, let's do it without him.
I think the saddest part is it's like 3 months after the Invasion angle ended, the nWo debuted. The night after the Invasion angle ended, Ric Flair debuted on Raw. Like, you were that close to getting a taste of what really could have been.
Precisely, and if they held on for it a little bit, and I know we're jumping all over the place, but you can't help but rile up all these emotions
Yeah,
sometimes
that's true.
as you go back and forth. But Flair was again a huge corner piece.
Yep.
You know, a guy who lived and breathed WCW for the longest period of time, and him coming in November, literally the day after they shut the whole thing down, it was so sad to see.
It was. Yeah.
So, what sort of, or like, what contracts, if you had to pick 5 contracts, would you have had the WWE purchase from WCW or like AOL, Time Warner, so that the impact could have been there and the invasion angle would have been a moment in time that we would look back to be like, wow, they just killed it.
I think 5's easy. Let's go with 3.
Sure.
Top one on my list is going to be Flair.
Yeah.
And it showed when he was the first one in, and they ran with him in a wide, different sort of angles. You know, he was a guy who was controlling the company, then he's helping the nWo, then he's doing all these other things, but he was very versatile, as Flair has shown.
Yeah.
So he'd be on the top of my list.
Yeah.
And beyond that, it's the nWo. You know, you can have your pick, but Hall, Nash, Hogan, you can even wait on Hogan for a bit if he was like holding out and just bring in Hall and Nash and have them run like wreak havoc without even fighting and just stretching that out and doing the whole original Outsiders angle of just coming through the crowd, causing havoc, and almost trying to strike lightning twice by repeating how the nWo even originally formed.
For me, like, I think I'd go a little bit of a different route. Like, for me, the top 3 would have been Goldberg, Sting, and then Ric Flair. Like, as cool as the nWo would have been, like, for me, it's like, you know, all those guys, they were in the WWE for a long tenure of time. Hogan came back, Hall and Nash came back, and I guess for me, it's like, you know, the nWo run didn't go as well. So for me, I want to look back, like, what if the invasion had gone properly? Like, yeah, you would have loved to see the nWo, but you would have loved to see those 3 guys come in right away, and, you know, the matches that we got all these years later, what it could have been like in 2001. So for me, it'd be Sting, Flair, and Goldberg.
Yeah, and for me, I think I would have to take a bit of like your guys' answer. For me, number 1 would have been Sting. I think that would have been a perfect time, especially given their age, to have that Taker versus Sting match that we discussed in the previous episode. And then number 2 would have been Ric Flair. Ric Flair is just a massive personality, great wrestler. He could still do it at that age. Great on the mic. He could have just been used in so many different venues. So it would have been Flair number 2, and then number 3 probably would have been, like, honestly, like, I think Hogan would have just cost too much. So I think I agree with you, TJ. I think Hogan is just kind of out of the picture. I think he just wanted way too much to be bought out. So I probably would have just gone with Hall and Nash, and then just kind of like what you said, just kind of have them run with the whole Outsiders angle until Hogan's contract was up, and then have him join them a year later.
Do you think they could have made it work with Hollywood Hogan solo at that point in his career?
I think if they were to bring him over, I think he would have had to come in as the red and yellow Hogan, the Hulkamaniac, and then once Hall and Nash got there, and then kind of have him. Oh, so like, are you saying that if they had bought Hogan's contract first as opposed to Hall and Nash, or just saying it just in general that if his whole like Hollywood Hogan personality would have worked?
No, I'm saying like because you picked him as number 3, so he came in
Yeah.
by himself without the nWo.
No. So like what I said was that like I think like his contract would have been too much. So I think I would have let him sit out and just purchased Hall and Nash. But if kind of going with your question, if they had purchased Hogan's contract, only his and not Hall and Nash, I think Hollywood Hogan on his own wouldn't have worked. I think he would have had to come in as the red and yellow Hogan, and then eventually have him team up with Hall and Nash, and
Yeah,
then turn Hollywood.
Yeah, like as you saw, like as soon as Hogan came in, his reaction was different. Even when the NWO debuted, like they had no choice but to turn him into a babyface just because like the crowd reaction. You got to realize the WWF fans never saw Hogan as a heel. He was always red and yellow Hulk Hogan. So even when he debuted in the black and white with the NWO, like he was still getting the standing ovation. Like, they still talk about how during that match with The Rock, like they altered roles where Rock took on the heel persona and Hogan was the babyface just because that's what the crowd wanted. So I think
Yeah.
there was no way you could bring Hogan in as a heel. It wouldn't have worked.
I think it still could have worked. I think it definitely could have worked with the support of the NWO thing. I think the red and yellow is always going to be a soft spot for wrestling fans, WWE fans, and more so as a respect thing than anything else. And that's why you saw the standing ovations. That's why you saw that crowd reaction in Toronto when it was Rock versus Hogan. And like you mentioned, they swapped in the middle of the match.
Yep.
They read the energy and they're like, we're going to swap roles. You go babyface, I go heel, and we're going to run with this. And then came the red and yellow. But I think it was wise of them, especially when you're bringing in the angle of invasion, aggression. He said it's like injecting poison. It's hard to come in as a babyface when you're trying to set it up as you're coming into our turf and trying to take over.
Yeah.
But I think Hogan, like, no one ever really saw him as a WCW guy.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Like Hogan was always WWE. He was in WCW for what, a handful of years, but it was just he was never perceived as a WCW guy. So when Hogan came back, like as much as you look back and be like, the NWO should have been such a big part of the invasion. Like everybody saw Hogan as a WWF guy, even Hall and Nash, like because they were Diesel and Razor and they had success. Like despite the NWO, being the NWO, like they were still in a way looked at as WWF guys.
I'm not gonna lie. As much as I love the whole Outsiders thing, the NWO thing, I'm a huge Razor Ramon guy, and I really would have loved if Scott Hall went back to that Razor Ramon persona. I hated Diesel; I thought it was stupid, but Razor Ramon was awesome.
No, I agree with that one.
I don't know. Like, I think the whole Razor Ramon persona in the 90s worked, but I think in the 2000s, especially coming out of like the Attitude Era, I think if he were to go back to the Razor Ramon persona, I think Scott Hall just worked so well for him. Just like that was him. Like it was just him being real, and I thought it really connected with people. And I would probably say that his Scott Hall persona was probably bigger in terms of popularity than his Razor Ramon persona.
Yeah, I would agree. So like, I mean, I feel like, when he was in WWF as Razor Ramon, like, the biggest reason he left is, he talks about this when he had the conversation with Vince, like, Vince, what do I need to become a top guy, to become a main event guy, to make that kind of big money? And, Vince said nothing, but it was just, he couldn't get over the hump when guys like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart and The Undertaker. So that was the biggest reason he left. So, in WWF, he was a mid-carder. He was never really given a championship. He was never really put in that main event spot. That was the biggest reason he left. Whereas, with the NWO, they were on top of the world.
But it's also, again, it's interesting to see, especially as a Razor Ramon persona. Like if you look at the gimmick itself, he's doing this whole the Tony Montana thing, the toothpick, the slick hair, and it's super cheesy, even at that time. But people got behind it. He had one of the sickest finishers ever in the Razor's Edge.
Yeah.
And it was another thing that people brought into, right? The chains, talking to the guy who takes the chains, something's going to happen to you. People started following all these little things. And even as a mid-carder, like those ladder matches that he had with Michaels, the Intercontinental runs that he had,
Epic.
the first time, 3-time champs, like he had so much going on as a mid-carder. It's unfortunate that no one saw him to be going to the next level because he was carrying that Intercontinental division for a while as Michaels and them came up.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that even, in WCW, he was one of the few guys. Like, WCW made David Arquette champion, but for whatever reason, Scott Hall was never made world champion. Like, that's one of those, even WCW, I guess, despite being in the NWO, being one of the top tier guys, he was never given a title run at all. So that one's one of those another what ifs. Like, what if Scott Hall had become world champion?
Yeah. I also wonder how much of his personal struggles might have led to some of that decision making, and having him as a champion. I mean, don't get me wrong. At the end of the day, you have David freaking Arquette as your champion. Not worried too much about image.
Yeah,
But I do wonder how much that played in.
I'm
I
sure it
think
did.
yeah, I think so too.
So talking about the NWO, Baldy, do you want to maybe just kind of give a quick recap as to how they were introduced to the WWE universe?
So the night after Survivor Series, like as we touched on, Ric Flair debuted, and it was shown that he had bought the 50% share from Stephanie and Shane, so him and Vince were partners, which eventually led to a street fight at the Royal Rumble where Flair defeated Vince McMahon, believe it or not. And it's funny how Flair talks about now. When he came into the WWF, he didn't want to wrestle. His plan was not to wrestle. Like he wanted to just be on screen
Oh,
character,
that.
and wrestling was not in the cards until later
Yeah,
on.
Flair
So
says a lot of things. This is a
I
guy
know.
who's retired about 20 different times and come back 20 different times. But I was going to say, it's also it's kind of funny looking back to think how much both McMahon, Shane, and Vince were fighting actively on cards at that time. Like
yeah,
they
it
were
was
involved in
quite
a lot of
frequent.
matches.
Yeah, because Vince and Shane had fought at the prior WrestleMania at WrestleMania 17, and then Vince is in a street fight against Ric Flair at Royal Rumble 2002, and so after losing that match, Vince kind of went a little crazy, and because Flair ended up getting full control of the WWF, so Vince decided to, as he likes to say, I'm gonna inject the poison, which was the NWO that he decided to bring in.
Okay, so then they made their debut at which pay-per-view again?
It was at No Way Out, so February of 2002 was where they debuted.
Okay, and then do you want to maybe describe on like how they debuted?
So they kind of just opened up the show and just kind of talked about, hey, as Vince McMahon says, we're the poison, but we're not here to be
Yeah.
the poison. We just want to be one of the boys. We want to just join in, and they cut promos with Stone. They ran into Stone Cold and The Rock later on, and then the end of the show, it was Stone Cold against Chris Jericho for the WWE World Championship, and they ended up costing Stone Cold the match, and then that kind of led into the rivalries, which eventually led to Rock and Hogan at WrestleMania and Stone Cold and Scott Hall at WrestleMania.
Yeah, so I mean, like I don't know, like what did you guys think of how they were introduced to the WWE universe?
One thing I actually really liked and I felt like they got right was at their entrance on No Way Out, they rocked the whole like black and white look with like the camera and everything.
Yeah,
And it was
I
very
like that too.
nostalgic to how the
Very well
NWO
done.
would like take over pay-per-views, and it was like it instantly worked.
It was very well done. Yeah, I like the build up to it. And I liked how, they were injected as the poison and whatnot. And, they kicked off the pay-per-view. Like I thought the whole debut was very well done. I like the build-ups to the
Even how they were
matches.
brought in.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
well
like
done.
speaking of the build-up, like the angle in terms of like Vince like losing his mind,
Yeah.
and he's like, "Yo, man, if I can't have my baby, so to speak, then no one can." And then saying, "You know what? I'm just gonna bring these guys in, dropping subtle hints, and then coming in." It was a great way for them to come in and take over.
Yeah, and like even the build-ups to the matches, like themselves, like Hogan crashed into the Rock's limousine with the Hummer. Like it was very WCW-esque in the sense that some of the stuff that they used to do, which I thought was a great way to introduce him to the crowd. That it's not the old faces that the fans remember, like with Hogan and Razor and Diesel. Like these are the WCW versions. So I thought that was a really great way to introduce him to the fans. And all the heel stuff that they did.
I loved that crashing thing. It was very like attitude relevant, and like you said, it wasn't. It made it seem like they were ready to ruffle some feathers and play on the level that the WWE was at that time.
Yeah, but like I think the one thing that kind of fell a bit flat is like when Vince kind of cut his promo on injecting the poison and all that stuff. I think we all knew what that poison was, right? Like there wasn't much of a element of surprise. Um, would you guys agree with that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I found it to be interesting in the sense that before he said it, it was, you saw him turn his chair around and then you saw the NWO letters
Mm-hmm.
on the back of his chair. So I thought that was pretty cool. Like, you didn't really know where he was going because, again, there
True,
were
but
rumors at that time.
like I agree with that with the whole chair term, but like when you think back to like introductions, right? Like you think of like when like Jericho came in. Yeah, some people knew, but you didn't really know like the whole countdown. When he came, you had the crowd pop, right? And just like a lot of the big moments in wrestling, when you think back to, you always think of the crowd reaction.
Yeah.
right? Like when like JR just going nuts, like, oh my God, I can't believe it's this person, right? Like you didn't have that because like with the whole chair turn and all that, like you knew what was coming, right? And like I just kind of felt like it just kind of fell flat a little bit in that sense.
I think with that, they wanted the anticipation built up. Like they didn't want a surprise debut because of who it was and the big names. They announced it beforehand, so the anticipation was built. I think that was the reason why they went that route. And they
Right.
announced who was coming, they announced when they were coming, so it just kind of built up the anticipation for it, which I get. Like you didn't obviously want that to just be like a surprise appearance when they show up. I mean, that would have been cool, but I
Yeah.
think in WWF's eyes, they wanted to capitalize on them making their return, and showing up. So they wanted to know well in advance that, hey fans, this is the pay-per-view they're going to debut at, so make sure you order it.
And not only that, but I also think they were a little bit more controlled in their approach because they still had the effects of that really bad invasion angle. So they didn't want anything to mirror or give people reminders of like this is invasion 2.0, this is what we're doing it again kind of thing. So this is more like Vince, not me, but like Vince coming in, grabbing these guys and bringing them on purpose and staying clear of that debacle that was the invasion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I never really thought about that, but I think that's a great point. Like, he injected him as, this is the WWF version of the NWO. This isn't, like you said, this isn't that invasion. This isn't WWE. This is the WWF version. So I think that was another way they went that route because, 3 months after you end the angle, you don't want to go right back into it again.
Yeah, I mean, those are all valid points, but I don't know. I'm always like the fan of the moment, right? And I like anytime you think of like when like Austin comes back when like no one was expecting him to or whatever, right? Just the crowd reaction, the surprise element. I wish it was a little bit more there with the NWO coming in because like the NWO like arguably was probably one of the biggest factions in wrestling history. So it just would have been really cool to see them make their first ever like mention or introduction with the whole crowd and seeing how that whole thing played out. But having said that, maybe this might be a good way to kind of turn our attention to how we would book the NWO coming into the WWE. So, Baldy, do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So, and a part of like a few of my points are kind of taken from Adam from What Culture. He did a great video on how he would book the NWO. And listening to that, I definitely liked some of his parts. So I'm gonna definitely take some parts from him, but kind of put my own little spin to it. So I like the whole power struggle between Vince and Flair. So the first thing I would do, obviously, would then be buying out Flair's contract so that he comes over. And I would have him and Vince kind of have that struggle for power. So um, when you saw Vince and Shane kind of having their little like struggle, like like Shane saying I bought WCW, and whatever, and then that kind of catching Vince off guard. At that point, I would kind of like set up that feud between Vince and Flair with Flair then coming out was like, yeah, well, you think you own WWE? It's actually 50-50, and that kind of setting up their match at Royal Rumble with the whole street fight for control, and with Flair winning that street fight like he actually did, hence giving him 50% of the ownership of WWE, Vince having 50% of the other share. And after the match, Vince, kind of is in his like kind of sorry state, just kind of like can't believe what's happening. His whole empire is crumbling before him, and he kind of cuts his whole promo of um, like releasing the poison and poisoning this company. Like, if I can't have it, none of you guys can. And again, so this street fight happens at Royal Rumble. I would say at maybe the second, third match of the pay-per-view, which then leads us to the 30-man Royal Rumble. And you kind of go through all 29 men, and then the 30th man countdown goes off, and you hear this music. And you have all 3 members of the NWO walk out. The crowd's going nuts. they are the 3 members that are entering as a 30th man. Again, it's unfair, but that's how nWo played with their rules. They were always unfair. They broke the rules. They made the rules. They come in at number 30th, clear house, beat up everyone. And the only wrinkle that I would do here is have then Hall and Nash kind of like look at each other. They kind of do like the whole head nod. They leave so that Hogan is the last man standing, which sets him up for a match with the champion at WrestleMania 18. And then the next night at Raw, they kind of just go nuts, just beating up Stone Cold, beating up Jericho, beating up Ric Flair and all that stuff. They're just like raising hell. And that sets up. So then what I would do from Royal Rumble to WrestleMania is have Austin be the champ, which sets up the dream match that we never had: Hogan versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's a match that I think we would all agree that that's one match that we always wish that we had but never had. So WrestleMania 18, instead of Rock versus Hogan, you have Austin versus Hogan for the championship belt. In the match, Austin's winning. He's about to pin Hogan, and The Rock comes out. He causes Austin to lose it. Hogan pins Austin 1, 2, 3. Hogan's the new champ. Rock rips off his shirt. He's the 4th member of the nWo. I think for the nWo to have some sort of legs, they needed some new blood to join, not just like X-Pac, Big Show. Just they needed some real kind of new blood to join. So you have 4 members of the nWo: Hall, Nash, Hogan, and The Rock. And they just go nuts, just kind of clearing house from WrestleMania to SummerSlam, which then leads you up to the run up to Survivor Series. And again, they're just clearing house, just kicking ass. And that's when I would have the return of Ric Flair come back in and be like, hey, you guys think you guys are controlling WWE? I have the other 50% share, which then leads to Survivor Series. And the main event there, I would have a 4-man tag, nWo The Rock versus Team Flair, which, could be Stone Cold, a bunch of guys. And I think this is where I would then have, and again, so this match, I know this is kind of like this is a lot, but I'm just trying to like summarize my points as quick as I can. In this match is basically the entire share of WWE is up for grabs here. So with nWo, you obviously have Vince's share. With Team Flair, you have like Flair's share. So during this match, it's nWo The Rock versus Team Flair again. And this is where you see a turn from The Rock, from a heel turn to a babyface, where he causes nWo to lose. Team Flair wins. Ric Flair controls the entire company. Vince is pissed. He starts going off at the nWo, which is now just comprised of 3 members: Hogan, Hall, and Nash. Nash and Hall turn on Hogan because like they just can't believe what happened. And basically this then sets up The Rock versus Hogan at WrestleMania 19. And we have our second dream match. And yeah, that's kind of how I would book the nWo's run in WWE. We kind of have 2 big bookends with Austin versus The Rock at WrestleMania 18, and then Austin versus Hogan at WrestleMania 18, and then Hogan versus The Rock at WrestleMania 19. 2 massive matches with a bunch of fun matches in between. Yeah.
I like where you went there, but it's part of it seems so similar to, what ended up happening, Survivor Series 2001. It essentially was a winner take all with Team WWF winning, and then it was Kurt Angle who was coincidentally, ended up joining the alliance, who ended up defecting to the WWF. So I like the similarities there. I think like I said, with Rock joining the nWo would have definitely given him credibility. So I like that idea. If I was booking it, I would have gone a different route. Some similarities, but I would have gone a different route. So I would have, WWE gets bought in March of 2001. I would have just let it die right there. Just let it die right there. WWF plays off their storylines. We're at January 2002, the Royal Rumble. Number 30, it's Hulk Hogan. Hogan comes in number 30. The crowd goes absolutely wild. He ends up winning the Royal Rumble at that pay-per-view. And what happened in reality was The Rock challenged Chris Jericho for the world title. I would have had The Rock win the title. You build to Hogan and The Rock, WrestleMania 18. What ended up happening? So you would have had, Rock turn heel, Hogan be the babyface like it was. But it's during that match in the main event where you see a surprise appearance from Hall and Nash, and that's where Hogan turns heel. Like he obviously, wins by cheating and ends up turning heel. Then the NWO, Hogan is the champion. Then the NWO ends up taking over. A couple months later, building up to that, you see Eric Bischoff make his debut as he actually did in '02. He's the leader of the NWO / WCW. And then one by one, you see the WCW guys slowly coming over. Goldberg, they buy out his contract. He makes his debut. Flair comes in. Scott Steiner comes in, and you slowly plant the seeds for all those feuds, for all those guys. And you have the invasion angle taking place, and you have it on a long run. Hogan beats The Rock. He holds on to his title. He ends up facing Triple H. He ends up facing The Undertaker. He ends up facing Jericho. He holds the title all this times, and then you get to WrestleMania 19, which coincidentally ended up being Stone Cold's last match. But that's where you have the dream match of Hogan versus Austin for the title, and that's where Hogan finally, after a 1-year reign, loses the title to Stone Cold. And then that's where Stone Cold rides off into the sunset as the world champion.
Let me just clarify for the record that what you're essentially saying, the same dude that last episode told everybody that Hulk Hogan was his hero and his favorite, talks to now about this huge bias of Hogan having this epic championship run with the title all the way for over a year and then dropping it to Austin.
Exactly. That's
Oh my God.
As the anti-Hogan hater who went absolutely nuts at WrestleMania 30 when his music hit, I feel like
I don't recall this. This is fake news. That's totally fake news.
This is what like you said, it's like AJ said, the two dream matches outside of Sting and Undertaker were Rock and Hogan, Rock and Austin. So for me, this is how I would have liked to see it. Hogan comes in obviously as the babyface. He turns heel, fans turn on him. You build it up, and then eventually you get to Austin and Hogan.
The common denominator in both those angles is that both of you are essentially saying that you're going to be waiting for essentially a year as these contracts are being bought out and then use them out instead of running with the angle, which is what they did right at Mania 17.
Yeah. Because I mean, like I said, as different wrestlers' contracts run out at different times. But if you look at the timetable that everybody debuted, Goldberg debuted April of 2003. I'm sure they could have bought him in 2002. Big Papa Pump debuted at Survivor Series 2002. Eric Bischoff debuted in July of 2002. The NWO debuted in February of 2002. So I feel like 2002 could have been the year where the invasion was done properly. And I feel like rather than 8 months, even longer than a year, if you look at all the pieces that could have come in and all the different matches, all the different rivalries, this is an angle that could have gone a very long time. So for me, that's why building up to Hogan and Austin would have been a 1-year build, because there were so many wrestlers.
Way too much Hogan. This guy just can't stop talking about freaking Hogan.
For me, I mean, I like it because, I mean, obviously it shares a lot of similarities with mine, where you kind of have two big matches, Hogan, Austin, Hogan, Rock. But the only thing, though, I think your booking, I guess, idea, I think it might lose some of its steam is right off the bat at WrestleMania 18 with Hogan versus Rock, because so you want him to have a heel turn there, but if you remember, that crowd was so hot. It would cheer for anything that Hogan would do, whether it was bad or good, right? I think it would have been hard for him to turn heel with that type of crowd that was so behind him. I don't think that crowd would have booed him at all.
But you got to look at it. Even like I said, just because the crowd booed him doesn't mean
it
would have been
boo
a babyface. Yeah, well, but even if they didn't boo him, because you look at that time, WWE kind of transitioned into, it wasn't just because of what guys did that they were babyface or heels, and some guys the crowds hated, others the crowd cheered for. Like Stone Cold and in perception was not supposed to be a babyface. Like look at some of the things that he did, but the crowd perception made him into a babyface. So I think even if Hogan had gone that heel route, like the NWO, like he was booed out of the building when they debuted, but a couple months later, it was the cool thing where even though he was a heel, the crowd cheered for him. So I think Hogan could have been the heel, and the crowd could have still cheered for him, but he still could have played the role of heel. Like he didn't
So you're saying
need
that
to.
at 18 in Toronto, he would be a heel or he would turn heel at the end of the match?
He turned heel at the end of the match.
But doesn't it defeat the purpose that if he turns heel, the crowd's cheering him on like crazy?
You don't know how the crowd. I don't know how the crowd would like. The crowd started
It's
cheering
Toronto,
for him.
man.
No, but
It's
here's
Toronto. Toronto went berserk for Hogan.
yeah, but that's because Hogan played into the babyface role. Like imagine the NWO debuts and Hogan ends up hitting The Rock with a steel chair, hits him with the title, and that's how he wins. You still like maybe they could have cheered him, maybe they would have booed him. Who knows? Like if that's
No, we both know, and actually all three of us know that he would have got cheered regardless. That crowd is not having any of it, no matter what he did. And the last thing you want to do is end off on this, like your biggest show of the year, on what you think is going to be like the biggest villain, and the people are like, "Hey man, good stuff, good job. Yeah, I'd cheer this guy."
yeah, but I think it could have gone either way. But I think even if the crowd did boo him, I still think he could have run with it.
The
I
crowd
still
wasn't going to boom. They were going to cheer him. That's
well,
the whole
even if they
point.
didn't, but even if they cheered him, I still think he could have run with it because at the end of the day, the NWO makes an impact. Like that's
Because his
how
name is Hogan, and he can make anything work.
exactly.
And so, who would you have join the NWO, or would you just have it the three of them?
I would have had the NWO as is, and then slowly I would have had the WCW guys debut. I wouldn't have added anybody else to the NWO. I would have just that's the beginning of the invasion. The NWO showing up right there is the beginning of the invasion, and piece by piece, as time goes, you see the different WCW guys, like the actual big name stars, showing up and making an impact, and then
But
eventually you end up
but so
having that whole invasion.
right, but so are you saying that slowly WCW guys would join the NWO?
No, not per se join the NWO, but I would have had like an invasion story. Like the NWO is sort of like their own entity, but then you have the WCW guys that end up becoming like it ends up becoming an invasion storyline where they may end up not necessarily teaming up, but they all would have had that in common where they're all former WCW guys now looking to make an impact in WWF. So the NWO would have been its own entity, but you would have had other members of WCW joining in.
Out of that whole eye-rolling manifesto of the Hulk Hogan fan club that you're president of, that you told us about, the only thing I liked that you said was that Eric Bischoff was going to come in and take the helms and
Well, you have
join
to.
that squad. And I think that would have been really, really good. And not the whole EC thing, but that sort of conniving, and he's back. And
Yeah.
it would have been so well if
Like I
Bischoff
think,
was running it.
yeah, like I think he like ended up he ended up being the face of it, and in essence in WCW, calling out Vince McMahon for that infamous match that never happened. So I think having Bischoff at the forefront would have done wonders for the whole NWO and for the whole invasion story angle.
I remember watching that when he called him out for that match, and I was like, "Yo, is he actually going to show up?" And then they were like building it up and pretending like the limo showed up and stuff. That was well done.
Yeah. Tej, any thoughts on your end?
I like both. I mean, for me, like both are convenient in the sense that you're still waiting, and that's what everybody wanted at the end of the day, was just waiting instead of running in with it when they did.
Well, with
I would have
mine, I think you could have started it if they had purchased it like 2 months early. So I know they purchased it in March, but if they had purchased WCW in like January and kind of had the whole Vince Flair, or even like because like I think you need the big matches at WrestleMania, like what Baldy was saying. So you kind of needed some time to kind of build up to those matches. And I think with them buying WCW in March, it just didn't give enough time to kind of really build anything towards it. I mean, you could have had, so like if you go with like my way of booking it, you could have had them just basically buying Flair's contract and just kind of having that little like dispute right off the bat when Shane bought WCW, and then with Vince being like, "Oh man, like I don't have WCW. I thought I did, but at least I have WWE." And then like Flair coming out immediately and be like, "Oh no, actually I have the other 50%." I don't know how he has the other 50%, but he does. So just kind of going off of that. So Flair could have just done that right off the bat, and you could have like started it pretty quick, and instead of waiting that 1 year.
But again, that'll go down as one of the greatest what ifs in
I
history.
also like the idea of them starting right off the bat, the same timeline, going with 17. You already have, like, what was it, Rock and Austin at 17?
Yeah, that was Rock and Austin.
And why not have the same thing that we spoke with, like you have Hall and Nash, the two guys that you only bought out of the big names that were sitting out, have them come through the crowd, interrupt that match, take out both of the biggest guys in the WWE at the time, and now establishing a war. Because they came in and they took out the top two guys,
Yeah.
and they're the ones reigning supreme at the end of Mania as it goes off the air.
Yeah, like I
What
think
better way to start off that whole run?
like I think in hindsight, like WWE regrets where WrestleMania 17 ended up ending with Austin turning heel. Like again,
For
that was
sure.
the
And
same.
17
That was
was amazing. It was one of the best.
well, that was one of the same thing as you say. The crowd, Toronto crowd, wouldn't have booed Hogan. Like they ended up trying to turn Austin heel in Texas, where the crowd went absolutely nuts as he's obliterating The Rock with chair shots. Like they weren't gonna boo him. Even when he shook hands with Vince, the crowd was like mixed reviews. Like what is going on? Like oh, this is cool. Like Vince turned babyface. Like that's what the perception the crowd has. So like WWE looked at like that's one thing we should go back. Like Bruce Pritchard says it multiple times. Like that was such a dumb idea to try and turn Austin heel in Texas. Like it doesn't matter what he did, they would have cheered for him.
Yeah, it's a benefit of a hometown crowd.
So are you saying that it's a bad idea to turn someone heel when the crowd's cheering for him? Is that what you just said?
Well, I think it depends. Like I said, different crowds.
AJ's ready to pounce on you. He's ready to make you eat your words. That's what he's setting
Yeah,
up
but
for.
Toronto wasn't Hogan's hometown. Toronto wasn't
But dude,
Hogan's hometown.
if you watch that pay-per-view, they were cheering for
Oh,
him
I know,
so
no,
bad.
100%. Yeah, but that's the thing. And here's the thing. They switched halfway through. Like, what if Hogan had done some of the stuff that he did in WCW? What if he ended up hitting The Rock with a chair or hit The Rock with
They
a
would have been
title?
cheering for that.
You
It's
don't
All
know
the
that.
more,
Toronto.
man. All
It's
the more.
Toronto.
Maybe they would have. Maybe they wouldn't have. You don't know that. That's
They
another
would
one of
have.
those what ifs.
They
That's
would
Baldy,
another what
Baldy,
ifs.
Baldy,
It's
you
not a
know
what
they
if.
would
That's a
have.
certainty. That's a certainty.
Yes.
That one we could say is definitely a certainty. But if going back to the whole like Hall and Nash coming to the crowd and disrupting Mania, they could have worked off limited appearances and just doing that
Yeah.
as they
Yeah.
stretched it out for quite some time, even up until like SummerSlam or something. And then you have Hogan come in the mix. And I'm all like, I totally, as much as I'm like anti-Hogan at the time and everything, Hogan would be the guy between that trifecta.
Of course.
Yeah.
He's the one having those big matches. He's the one that everyone's paying to see. And he's the one part of those dream matches, so like the big marquee matches. So it's not going to be like Nash and Austin that people want. It's not Nash and The Rock that people pay to see.
Yeah.
So I do concede that Hogan's going to be a big part of that, but I don't see him with this whole freaking year and a half run and all this other stuff that Baldy's trying to feed us.
Although I do just have to make a quick point, just so it's on record. One of the best persons to receive a Stone Cold Stunner and sell it the best is Scott Hall. So
Yeah. No,
seeing
that's
Scott
true.
Hall versus Stone Cold just for his reaction to the Stone Cold Stunner would have been worth it because he was
That
one
is-
of the best to do it.
That is
I don't
up
know,
there
man.
with The Rock.
I was going to say The Rock is probably one of the best for me when it comes to taking any sort of. He sells like no tomorrow.
Yeah, he does it a bit. I don't know. I mean, you
That's
are right.
the beauty of it. He overdoes it.
You are right. Like he does do a good job of it. But for me, Scott Hall is probably up there.
Let me correct you. He does the best job at it.
No. But okay, so that's how we would book the nWo run into WWE. Do you guys have any final thoughts?
No, I think we touched on topics, and I think this was a good episode where again we look at some of the different scenarios about what if and how if booking could have been successful.
So I think to summarize, I think what we would have wanted to see out of the nWo run is at least two marquee matches. So WWE hit on one. They did give us Rock versus Hogan, which was an instant classic, but we would have loved to see Austin versus Hogan. And that is one that I think we'll always regret not being able to see.
Yeah, I think, again, there was talk of if there was a plan for when Hogan came in, the Rock and Austin were the two big matches, and it's just, I think it was a difference of opinion with Hogan and Austin of who would take the win, who would take the loss.
Which is crazy for Hogan at that age to even think like, oh, well, I'm not going to take the loss. Like,
well, I think it was him coming in and saying, I'm not going to lose to both of them. But what's funny is, in fact, he ended up losing twice to Rock. Yeah, I know it's funny. Like you would think he's coming in, hey, I'm going to end up, getting a win back or whatnot. But I think it was, Hogan took the loss to The Rock, but he ended up being champion a couple of months later. So I think that was kind of the trade-off there. But him and Austin just.
Well, that's like how Punk drops in his infamous pipe bomb about how Vince and Dwayne are really good friends. So I'm sure that had something to do with it too.
There you go.
But you know, I mean, not to set up any sort of future what if episodes or anything, but I think it would have been really cool had they almost vindicated themselves and got a redo if they ever end up buying TNA and then did a invasion angle with them.
With
I think they
who?
could have done it so justice with all the TNA talent that they had at the time. Had they bought him out at the right time, not now. Like forget now. But back when you had Angle there, back when you had Sting there, back when you had Samoa Joe there, you know, and then run an
That would have been
Invasion
interesting.
2.0 angle with
Yeah,
TNA, it would have done so well.
that would have been interesting.
Imagine AJ Styles like leading the pack, and
Yeah, at
that
that
was
time.
his entry into WWE.
Yeah.
And now he's leading those guys. It would have been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, the guys like Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, like, they're still at the top of their game now.
Yeah,
But
that's
back then,
true.
like, they were having some amazing matches back in TNA.
Yeah, they could have done it really well. Even like I'm not a big Bullet Club fan, but they could have even done a Bullet Club version of this too.
Yeah.
Of them coming in and taking over because Bullet Club's worldwide.
Yeah, they are.
So
Okay,
I mean, so many chances. But I'm not going to go off the right.
No, hold on. I just need your answer to this one question. If they did bring in the TNA and did a whole invasion angle on that, which version of Sting would you want? Normal Sting or the Joker Sting? And yes, this is a serious question.
I'm not even going to answer this stupid question.
Like, why would he even agree to that? Like, anyways, that's for another topic. That's for another day.
God.
Okay, so that concludes this episode.
I was going to say that's as bad as the Blue Blazer gimmick, but I'm sure Baldy's a big fan of that gimmick also.
Hey, you can't speak ill of that gimmick of how it ended, okay? Come on now.
I meant to say the Patriot, not the Blue Blazer. I'm a fan of the Blue Blazer, but the Patriot.
I'm pretty sure Baldy was watching, not knowing who was the Patriot.
Yeah, that's what I meant to refer to. I said Blue Blazer by mistake, but I'm sure Baldy's like, oh man, Patriot's my next favorite wrestler.
I still wonder who he is.
I do wonder myself.
His real name is Del Wilkes, all right? Google it.
Okay, well, that concludes episode 2 of the how we would book the invasion / nWo angle. So then that sets up episode 3, and I guess we'll see what we cover for that episode.
Right after this episode, AJ's going to go look up and Google Buff is the stuff.